In the shadowed hollows of West Virginia, where the mountains fold in on themselves like a closed fist, some stories are not meant to be told. They are buried under generations of silence, festering in the dark soil alongside the bones of those they concern. They become whispers on the wind, a chill that runs down a traveler's spine for no reason he can name. The story of Silas Croft and his three daughters is one such tale. Before the law came to Blackwood Creek in the autumn of 1891, the truth was a local legend, a piece of grim folklore told to frighten children into obedience. They spoke of the Croft farmstead, a place of unnatural stillness sitting under the baleful gaze of Black Ridge. They spoke of Silas, a man whose piety was as sharp and cold as a winter frost. And they spoke of his daughters, Elara, Maeve, and Cora, three bright flames extinguished one by one, claimed by a swift and sudden consumption, or so the official story went. But the whispers told a different tale. They spoke of a secret kept beneath the packed earth, a horror locked away from the sun. The title of this account is not a spoiler, but a destination. The horror is not in the discovery, but in the journey to it, a path paved with willful blindness and a conspiracy of silence so complete it had the force of a gospel. This is the true story of the farmer's horrible secret, and how the truth of his three daughters was finally unearthed from the cold, suffocating darkness of the root cellar. Our account begins not with the farm, but with the man sent to pry open the closed fist of Blackwood Creek. United States Deputy Marshal Alastair Finch was a man forged in the crucible of city corruption and frontier lawlessness. He was tall and somber, with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised, yet held a flicker of outrage that had refused to be extinguished. He was an outsider by trade and by nature, a fact that made him both an object of suspicion and the only possible instrument for the truth. He did not come to Blackwood Creek seeking the ghosts of the Croft sisters. His quarry was a living man, or what was presumed to be one, a federal revenue agent named Thomas Reed, who had ridden into the valley 2 months prior to audit the county's tax ledgers and had vanished as if the very mountains had swallowed him whole. Finch's arrival was as quiet and unwelcome as the turning of the season. He rode in on a slate-gray afternoon, the sky a low, bruised ceiling that seemed to press down on the narrow valley. The town of Blackwood Creek was less a town than a handful of clapboard buildings clinging to the banks of a shallow, rock-strewn river, huddled together as if for comfort against the encroaching wilderness. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and something else, something less tangible, a deep, abiding stillness that felt more like paralysis than peace. Finch's first stop was the office of the local sheriff, a man named Jedediah Thorne. Thorne was a large man, soft in the middle, with a face that had long ago settled into an expression of weary compromise. He greeted Finch with a guarded courtesy that did not reach his eyes. "A federal man," Thorne said, leaning back in his creaking chair. "We don't get many of your kind up here. The world tends to forget about us, and we find that suits us just fine." Finch, ignoring the veiled warning, stated his business. "I'm looking for Agent Reed. His trail went cold right here in your valley." The sheriff chewed on the inside of his cheek, his gaze distant. "Reed? I remember him. A fussy little man, always scribbling in his book. He asked his questions, looked at the county records, and then he was on his way. Or so I thought. Which way was that?" Finch pressed. Thorne waved a vague hand towards the oppressive wall of mountains. "He had business up at the Croft place. Silas Croft, one of our finest citizens, a pillar of this community. Reed went up there to settle some tax matter. Silas said he paid the man what was owed, and Reed rode on, heading east over the ridge." The name was dropped with a careful, deliberate weight, as if it were a stone being placed on a board. Croft. Finch felt a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The tightening of a string he hadn't known was there, and no one's seen him since. "The mountains are treacherous," Thorne said, his voice a low platitude. "A man can get lost. A horse can throw a shoe. Nature has its own laws up here, Marshal, harsher than yours or mine." It was a dismissal, polite and absolute. Finch knew then that he would get no help from the law in Blackwood Creek. He was alone, As he stepped out of the sheriff's office and back into the oppressive gray light, he felt the weight of the town's collective gaze upon him. He was a stone tossed into a stagnant pond, and the ripples of his presence were already beginning to disturb a surface that had been still for a very long time. He could feel the secret, a sleeping beast, stir in its slumber. The investigation began, and with it, the construction of a wall. It was a wall not of brick or stone, but of pleasantries, of folksy wisdom, of downcast eyes and sudden, urgent business elsewhere. When Alastair Finch asked about Thomas Reed, the people of Blackwood Creek would answer, but their words were like mist, offering no substance, no purchase. At the general store, a cramped space smelling of kerosene and dried apples, the proprietor, a thin, nervous man named Elias, polished a glass counter that was already gleaming. Agent Reed? Oh, yes. A city man, you could tell. Bought a tin of peaches and a new pencil. Said he was heading up the valley. A terrible shame. What can happen in these hills? A man must watch his step. He would say no more, his attention suddenly consumed by the stacking of canned goods. At the small, whitewashed church that stood at the head of the valley, the preacher, a fiery-eyed man named Reverend Miller, offered prayers for the lost soul. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away, he intoned, his voice resonating with practiced authority. This is a land of trials. It tests a man's faith. Perhaps your agent was found wanting. When Finch pressed, asking if Reed had spoken to anyone in the congregation, the Reverend's eyes hardened. His business was with the world, Marshall, not with God. He spent his time counting coin. He went to see the one man in this valley who has more than his share of it. He went to see Silas Croft. Again, the name. It was the hub of the wheel, the center from which all spokes of conversation radiated and to which they all returned. And each time it was spoken, it was accompanied by that same subtle, almost imperceptible flinch, a tightening around the eyes, a brief hesitation before the requisite praise was offered. A good man, Silas, Elias the storekeeper had added quickly. God-fearing, hard-working, a pillar of our flock, Reverend Miller had declared. The salt of the earth. Yet Finch, a man who traded in the nuances of human deceit, could sense the lie beneath the polished surface. It was in the way they refused to meet his gaze when they said the name. It was in the way a mother would pull her child a little closer if the Croft farm was mentioned. He began to ask a different question, a tangential inquiry born of a lawman's intuition. He started asking about the farm itself, about the family. It was then that the wall of pleasantries became a wall of granite. The Crofts keep to themselves, was the common refrain. Tragedy visited that house many years ago. It is not our place to speak of it. He learned, in clipped, reluctant sentences, that Silas Croft's wife, Martha, had died of a wasting sickness a decade past. And his daughters, the three girls who had been the light of the valley, had followed her not long after. Consumption, Sheriff Thorne supplied when Finch returned to his office, his frustration mounting. A terrible thing. Took all three of them within a year of each other. Alara, then Maeve, then the little one, Cora. Broke Silas's heart, it did. He's never been the same. Buried them himself up on the ridge behind his house. The story was too neat, too tragic, too symmetrical. Three healthy young women, all struck down in quick succession by the same ailment. It was possible, of course. Sickness was a cruel and indiscriminate reaper. But Finch's instincts, honed by years of listening to well-rehearsed falsehoods, screamed that this was a performance. One evening, sitting in the town's only boarding house, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, he overheard a snatch of conversation between two old farmers, their voices low and raspy. "That Marshall is still poking round," one said. He was asking about the Croft girls. The other man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the hearth. "Some things are best left buried. He stirs that pot. It'll poison the whole valley." Finch turned, his expression unreadable. "What poison is that?" The two men froze, their faces paling. They looked like schoolboys caught in a transgression. "Nothing, Marshall," the first one stammered, rising to his feet. "Just old men's talk. We meant no disrespect." They scurried out of the room, leaving Finch alone in the deepening twilight. The poison of the valley. He was beginning to understand. The missing revenue agent was merely a symptom. The disease was older, deeper, and its name was Croft. The community was not just silent, it was complicit. They were guardians of a secret, and they would protect it at any cost, not from a sense of malice, but from a desperate, primal fear of what its revelation might unleash. He knew then that his path led inevitably to the Croft farmstead, to the heart of the silence. He had to face the pillar of the community himself. The ride to the Croft farm was a journey into a deeper quiet. The road narrowed from a rutted track to little more than a deer trail, winding upwards into the dense, ancient woods that clawed at the slopes of Black Ridge. The air grew cooler, heavier. The chirping of insects and the calls of birds seemed to die away, replaced by an expectant hush. The forest floor was a thick carpet of damp, decaying leaves that muffled his horse's hoof falls, and the trees, immense and gnarled, formed a canopy so thick that the gray afternoon light was reduced to a dim, cathedral-like gloom. Finally, the woods broke, and he found himself looking upon the farm. It sat in a clearing that felt less carved from the wilderness than grudgingly seated by it. The house was a stern, two-story salt box, its once white paint peeled and weathered to the color of old bone. A large, dilapidated barn stood nearby, its roof sagging in the middle like a broken spine. The fields, however, were immaculate. Rows of late-season corn stood in perfect, disciplined lines, and a vegetable garden near the house was meticulously tended, free of any weeds. It was a place of stark, unsettling contrasts: decay and order, wildness and control. A man was standing in the yard, splitting wood with a rhythmic, powerful swing of an axe. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a full, gray-streaked beard and a head of thick, unruly hair. As Finch dismounted, the man stopped, resting the axe head on the chopping block. His eyes, a pale and piercing blue, fixed on Finch with an unnerving intensity. This was Silas Croft. "You must be the marshal," Silas said. His voice was a low baritone, calm and resonant. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being heard. "Sheriff Thorne said you might be paying me a visit." "I am," Finch replied, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. "I'm investigating the disappearance of Thomas Reed. I was told he was last seen here." Silas nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. He came to look over my accounts. Found them in order, as they always are." I gave him a drink of water, and he rode on. He mentioned heading east towards the pass. He spoke with an air of simple, unassailable truth. There was no hesitation, no flicker of deceit in those piercing eyes. Yet, Finch felt a profound sense of unease, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the chill in the air. He was in the presence of something ancient and powerful, a will as unyielding as the granite of the mountains. "I see," Finch said, letting the silence stretch. He surveyed the property, his gaze lingering on the house. "You have a fine piece of land here, Mr. Croft." "It is God's land," Silas corrected him gently. "I am merely its steward. I work it, and I honor him with my labor." The piety was there, just as everyone had said, but it felt different coming from the man himself. It was not a comfort or a faith, but a weapon and a shield. It was the source of the iron control that radiated from him, that kept his fields immaculate while the forests sought to reclaim them. Finch decided to press, to test the seamless surface of the man's composure. "The sheriff mentioned your family, the tragedy you endured. I'm sorry for your loss." For the first time, a shadow passed over Silas Croft's face. It was a fleeting expression, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker in the depths of those blue eyes. He looked away, towards a small, fenced-off plot of land on a rise behind the house, where 3 simple wooden crosses stood. "The Lord saw fit to call my daughters home," he said, his voice taking on a tone of rehearsed, somber recitation. "Their bodies were too frail for this world. Their souls were too pure. I laid them to rest myself. It was a father's final duty." He spoke the words like a catechism, a text learned by heart. But Finch noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he gestured towards the graves, the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped the handle of the axe. "All 3 of them?" Finch asked, his voice deliberately neutral. Consumption is a cruel disease. Silas turned back to him, and the mask of the grieving father was perfectly in place once more. But this time, Finch could see the cold fury behind it. It was the fury of a king whose authority had been questioned. It was God's will martial. "Who are we to question it?" he said, his voice soft, yet carrying an unmistakable threat. "Agent Reed finished his business here and left. That is all I know. Now, if you'll excuse me, the days are getting shorter. There is work to be done." It was a dismissal as absolute as the one he had received from the sheriff, but infinitely more chilling. As Finch mounted his horse and rode away, he did not look back, but he could feel Silas Croft's eyes on him, two chips of ice in the gathering gloom. He had met the pillar of the community, the monster at the heart of the story. And he knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that the man was a liar. The graves were a lie. The story was a lie. And the missing Agent Reed had not simply gotten lost in the mountains. He had gotten too close to the truth. The wall of silence in Blackwood Creek was solid, but Alastair Finch was a patient man. He knew that even the most solid wall has a crack, a loose stone, a place where the mortar has begun to crumble. He needed to find that weakness. His investigation into the missing agent had stalled, blocked at every turn by the looming shadow of Silas Croft. He realized he was asking the wrong questions of the wrong people. The town's fear of Croft was a form of worship, and its pillars, the sheriff, the preacher, the storekeeper, were his high priests, enforcing the doctrine of silence. To break the spell, he needed to find a heretic. His search led him to the name of Agnes Blackwood. It was not a name that was offered willingly. He heard it muttered by a blacksmith's wife, a hushed warning to her child who had wandered too close to the edge of the woods. "Stay away from the Blackwood place. The old woman will snatch you." When he asked Sheriff Thorne about her, the man had sighed with exasperation. "Agnes? She's a crazy old recluse. Hasn't come into town in 20 years. Lives in her family's old cabin up by the falls. Thinks the town is cursed. Best to leave her be. Marshall, she's got nothing for you but mad ramblings." A crazy old woman who thought the town was cursed. To Finch, this sounded less like madness and more like clarity. Agnes Blackwood was the last of her line, the family that had first settled the valley and given it their name before being slowly displaced by newcomers like Silas Croft. She was an outcast, a ghost from the valley's past. She was perfect. He found her cabin nestled in a grove of ancient hemlocks, almost invisible until he was upon it. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney, the only sign of life. The place was surrounded by a crude but effective fence of sharpened stakes, a clear message to the outside world. As he approached the gate, a figure appeared in the cabin's doorway. She was small and hunched, wrapped in a dark shawl, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes bright and sharp as a bird's. "State your business," she called out, her voice a dry rasp. "I'm not buying what you're selling, and I've got no time for sermons." "My name is Alastair Finch. I'm a deputy U.S. Marshal," he said, holding his hands up where she could see them. "I'm not selling or preaching. I just want to ask you some questions." "The law has no business here," she spat. "The law in this valley is whatever Silas Croft says it is. It's the law of the wolf in the sheep pen. Go away. It's Silas Croft I want to ask you about," Finch said, his voice steady. "And his daughters." The old woman flinched, a barely perceptible movement, but he saw it. He had struck a nerve. He saw a flicker of something in her sharp eyes. Not madness, but a deep, ancient grief. She stared at him for a long moment, her gaze raking over him, weighing and measuring. She was looking not at his badge, but into his soul, searching for the resolve she had found lacking in every other man for the past 2 decades. "You're the one they're all whispering about," she said, her tone softening slightly. "The outsider. The one who won't leave it be." "I'm the one," Finch affirmed. After another long silence, she gave a curt nod. "Come in, then, but wipe your feet. The dirt of that town is not welcome in my house." The inside of the cabin was a single room, cluttered but clean. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and every surface was covered in books and stacks of old newspapers. It was the home of a mind that had refused to stagnate. Agnes gestured to a simple wooden chair. They told you I was mad, didn't they? She asked, her back to him as she stoked the fire. It's what they say about any woman who sees the truth and is foolish enough to speak it. They said you were a recluse. Finch answered honestly. They were right about that, she said, turning to face him. I made a choice. I could live among them and be silent, or I could live alone and keep my soul. I chose my soul. She told him then of Martha Croft, Silas's wife. They had been friends in their youth, before Silas's piety had soured into a possessive poison. Martha was full of light, Agnes said, her voice thick with memory. But he slowly extinguished it. He saw sin in everything, in a smile, in a song, in the color of a ribbon in her hair. He built a prison of piety around her, and she withered in it. Agnes had been the midwife who delivered all three of the Croft girls. Alara, with her mother's light. Maeve, with her father's stubborn will. And little Cora, who was quiet and watchful. I saw the way he looked at them. Agnes continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Not with a father's love, but as a warden looks at his prisoners. They were his property, extensions of his own will. He feared them, you see. He feared the world that was in them, the life that he had tried so hard to crush in their mother. Her words painted a picture that resonated with the cold dread Finch had felt at the farm. He knew he had found his ally, the keeper of the first truth. He leaned forward, his voice low. What happened to them, Agnes? The real story. The old woman's face crumpled, the grief of 2 decades finally breaking through her hardened exterior. Tears welled in her bright eyes. He didn't bury them on that ridge, she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of sorrow and rage. He buried them alive. Agnes Blackwood rose from her chair and walked to an old, iron-strapped chest in the corner of the room. She knelt with the stiffness of age and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of dried lavender and old paper filled the small cabin. From beneath a pile of yellowed linens, she withdrew a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth with time and handling. She held it for a moment, her gnarled fingers caressing the cover as if it were the face of a lost child. Martha was a reader, Agnes said, her voice soft. A writer. It was the one part of herself she managed to keep from him. She knew he was a monster, long before anyone else would admit it. She saw the darkness in him, saw the way it was turning on her girls. She was afraid, not for herself, but for them. She held the book out to Finch. She gave this to me the last time I saw her. She made me swear to keep it safe. She said, if anything happens to me, Agnes, the truth is in here. Don't let him write the story. A week later, she was dead. A sudden fever, he said. The whole town nodded and mourned and forgot. Finch took the book. It felt heavy in his hands, dense with the weight of unspoken secrets. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, a woman's careful script, though it grew more frantic and jagged in the later entries. He sat by the fire, the dying afternoon light filtering through the cabin's single grimy window, and he began to read. The narration that follows is from the words of Martha Croft, a voice from the grave, a testament to a horror that had been allowed to fester in the heart of the valley. Asterisk October 3rd, 1879. Silas brought me a new Bible today. It is bound in black leather with no ornamentation. He said our old one, my mother's, was too worldly. He has taken to reading aloud every evening for hours. The passages he chooses are always of wrath and judgment. He speaks of the depravity of the world outside our valley, of the sins of the flesh that lie in wait for the unwary. When he speaks, his eyes burn with a cold fire. My daughters sit and listen, their faces pale. Alara, my brave Alara, looks down at her hands. I see the rebellion in the set of her jaw. I fear for her. Asterisk Finch read on, the words painting a portrait of a man's descent into a private, fanatical madness, and the slow, methodical construction of a prison disguised as a home. The entries detailed Silas's escalating restrictions. First, it was the books, then the music. He forbade the girls from walking into town unaccompanied. He declared that their education was complete, that any further learning would only fill their heads with sinful, worldly ideas. Asterisk, May 12th, 1880. A letter arrived today for Alara. It was from a Miller boy in the next county. A sweet, clumsy poem. She tried to hide it, but Silas saw the blush on her cheek. He snatched it from her hand. I have never seen such a look on his face. It was not anger. It was a kind of righteous terror. He called her a harlot, a vessel of sin, right there in front of her sisters. He took the letter and burned it in the stove. He said he had been too lenient. He said he had failed in his duty to God to protect their souls from corruption. The door to the outside world, he declared, was now closed. For their own good, asterisk, the journal became a chronicle of suffocation. Martha described the house growing quieter, the laughter of her daughters fading, replaced by a tense, fearful silence. Silas's control became absolute. He patrolled the house like a jailer, his presence a constant, oppressive weight. The farm was no longer a home. It was a fortress designed not to keep intruders out, but to keep its inhabitants in. Finch felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He was no longer just a lawman investigating a disappearance. He was a confessor, receiving the final testimony of a woman who had seen the abyss opening beneath her family and had been powerless to stop them from falling in. He turned the page, his hands trembling slightly, and came to the entry that marked the beginning of the end. Asterisk, June 2nd, 1880. He has done it. He has done the unthinkable. He found Alara trying to slip a letter out with the man who buys our corn. A simple note to the Miller boy to tell him she was all right. Silas did not rage. He was calm. It was the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. He took Alara by the arm, and his voice was soft as he told her that her soul was in mortal peril. He said the corruption had taken root in her, and it must be scoured out in darkness and solitude. He dragged her to the root cellar. He shoved her inside and bolted the heavy oak door. He said she would stay there until her spirit was cleansed, until she was pure. He is standing guard at the door now, reading his Bible aloud. I can hear her weeping. God help us. God help my child. Asterisk. Finch's blood ran cold. The journal in his hands was no longer just a record of domestic tyranny. It was the story of a crime in progress, a descent into a horror he could scarcely comprehend. He read on, his breath catching in his throat, as Martha Croft's elegant script chronicled the sealing of the tomb. The entries became shorter, more desperate, blots of ink marring the pages like teardrops. Asterisk, June 4th, 1880. 2 days. She has been in the dark for 2 days. He allows her a bucket for waste and a single meal of bread and water, passed through a slot he cut in the door. Maeve and Cora are like ghosts. They will not speak. They will not eat. Last night, I heard them whispering. They were planning to steal the key from his room while he slept. They mean to free her. My brave, foolish girls. They do not understand the nature of the monster they live with. They think he is just their father. They do not see the zealot who has consumed him. Asterisk, the next entry was written in a hand so shaky it was barely legible. The ink was smeared, as if written through tears. Asterisk, June 5th, 1880. He caught them. He was waiting. It was a trap. I heard the scuffle, the girls' cries of terror, and his voice, not loud, but terrible in its calm certainty. So the sickness has spread, he said. The sin of one has infected you all. He did not beat them. It was worse than that. He opened the cellar door, and the darkness seemed to breathe. He told Maeve and Cora that if they wished to be with their sister, so be it. He forced them down the steps. I heard Alara cry out as they were pushed inside. Then the bolt slid home. All three of my girls are in the earth. He has buried them alive. Asterisk, Finch had to close his eyes. He could picture the scene with sickening clarity. The dark, damp cellar, the terror of the girls, the father standing over them, his face illuminated by a single lantern, his expression one of serene, monstrous conviction. He was not punishing them. He was saving them. In his twisted, fanatical mind, this was an act of supreme love. The journal continued, a litany of despair. Martha described her attempts to reason with him, to plead with him. He would simply smile, a serene and terrible smile, and tell her to pray for their souls. He told her the house was now a sanctuary, a holy place, purified of the world's filth. His daughters were being protected, consecrated. Asterisk July 17th, 1880. A month. They have been down there for over a month. I hear things sometimes at night. Scratching sounds. Sometimes a low moan like an animal in pain. Or perhaps I am imagining it. My mind is not clear. The tea Silas brings me each evening, it has a bitter taste. It makes me so very tired. My hands tremble. It is difficult to write. He knows I know. He sees the accusation in my eyes. He is erasing me, just as he erased them. Asterisk the final entries were a descent into delirium and fading consciousness. They were scrawled, fragmented phrases. Asterisk he tells the neighbors they are ill. Consumption. No visitors. He is building the story piece by piece. The town believes. They want to believe. It is easier. Asterisk Agnes. Remember your promise. The truth in this book, asterisk, and then the last entry, just 2 words written with the final dregs of a dying woman's strength, a testament and a plea. My girls, Finch closed the book. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the cabin was filled with a profound and heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Agnes Blackwood quietly weeping in the corner. He now held the truth in his hands, a truth far more monstrous than the simple murder of a revenue agent. Thomas Reed hadn't just been silenced. He had been erased for stumbling upon a decade-old atrocity. Finch looked at Agnes, her face a mask of grief. He poisoned her, he said, his voice a low growl of righteous fury. Agnes nodded, wiping her eyes with the corner of her shawl. He is a man who solves his problems by burying them. The weight of his duty settled on Finch's shoulders, heavier than it had ever been. This was no longer about a missing agent. This was about Alara, Maeve, and Cora Croft. It was about a promise made to a dead woman. He had the truth. Now he had to drag it, kicking and screaming, into the light. Armed with the devastating truth of Martha Croft's journal, Alastair Finch felt the last vestiges of procedural caution burn away, replaced by a cold, righteous fire. He rode back to the center of Blackwood Creek, the leather-bound diary a damning weight in his saddlebag. The sun was setting, painting the bruised sky in lurid shades of orange and purple, the kind of beautiful, indifferent sunset that mocks the ugliness of men. His first and only stop was the sheriff's office. He strode in without knocking. Jedediah Thorne was at his desk, laboring over some paperwork by the light of a kerosene lamp. He looked up, his expression of weary annoyance quickly souring to alarm at the look on Finch's face. "Marshal, I thought we concluded our business," Thorne began, his voice attempting a bluster it could not sustain. Finch didn't speak. He simply walked to the desk, opened the journal, and placed it in the pool of yellow light. "This," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "is the last will and testament of Martha Croft." Thorne stared at the book as if it were a coiled snake. He did not touch it. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do, Sheriff," Finch said, his voice cutting through the man's pretense. "I think you've known for 10 years. Maybe you didn't know all of it, but you knew something was wrong. You knew those girls didn't die of consumption. You knew Silas Croft was a liar, and you looked the other way." Thorne's face, already pale in the lamplight, seemed to lose all its color. His bluff crumbled, and the cowardly, frightened man beneath was laid bare. "You don't understand," he stammered, his eyes darting around the room as if seeking an escape. "This is a quiet place, a peaceful place. Silas, he's a founding father of this community. People respect him. He owns half the land, holds the debt on the other half. To go against him is to go against the whole valley. So you chose peace over justice," Finch stated. "It wasn't a question. You chose your own comfort over the lives of 3 young women." Thorne slumped in his chair, a broken man. The confession, when it came, was a torrent of whispered, self-serving excuses. "I didn't know," he insisted, though his eyes betrayed him. "Not for sure. People whispered. We heard stories. But Silas was so convincing. He had the preacher on his side. He spoke of his grief, of God's will. What was I to do? Accuse a man like that, with no proof? The town would have run me out on a rail." He looked up at Finch, his eyes pleading for an understanding he did not deserve. After a while, the story just became the truth. We all told it to ourselves so many times that we started to believe it. It was easier. It was better for everyone to believe the girls were in heaven than to imagine what the alternative might be. The conspiracy of silence, Finch realized, was not an act of collective malice. It was an act of collective cowardice. It was the desperate, pathetic bargain of a community that had traded its soul for a quiet life. They had seen the wolf among the sheep and had chosen to admire his fleece rather than acknowledge his teeth. What about Reed? Finch pressed, his disgust a palpable force in the small room. What did he find? Thorne swallowed hard. Reed was a numbers man, meticulous. He went to the Croft farm, and he must have seen something that didn't add up. Maybe it was the amount of food Silas was buying. Maybe it was a noise he heard. He came to me later that day. He was agitated. He said he thought Silas Croft was holding someone captive. He said it was his duty to report it. And what did you do? Finch asked, though he already knew the answer. Thorne couldn't meet his gaze. He stared down at his own trembling hands on the desk. I told him he was crazy, the sheriff whispered. I told him he was letting the mountains play tricks on his mind. I told him to finish his business and leave the valley before he stirred up trouble we couldn't put down. I told him to leave Silas Croft alone. He finally looked up, his face a mask of pathetic regret. He didn't listen. He must have gone back. He must have confronted Silas on his own. And Silas had solved the problem. He had buried it, just like he had buried his wife, just like he had buried his daughters. The sheriff had not pulled the trigger, but he had loaded the gun and pointed it at Thomas Reed. He was as guilty as if he had. Finch felt a profound wave of contempt. There was no help here. The law in Blackwood Creek was a hollow shell, rotted from the inside out by fear and compromise. He turned his back on the sheriff. "Where are your deputies?" "It's just me," Thorne said, his voice small. "The last one quit a year ago." "Of course." Finch walked to the door. "For the sake of your soul, whatever is left of it, you'll stay here. You will not send word to Croft. You will not interfere. This ends tonight." As he stepped out into the night, leaving the sheriff to wallow in his own shame, Finch knew he was utterly alone. He was one man against a monster, in a valley that had long ago made a pact with the dark. A storm was gathering over the ridges, the wind beginning to howl through the narrow streets. It felt fitting. The false peace of Blackwood Creek was about to be broken by a tempest. The ride back to the Croft farm was a battle against the elements. The storm that had been threatening all evening broke with a sudden, violent fury. A curtain of rain, as cold and hard as buckshot, swept through the valley, turning the trail to a slick, treacherous river of mud. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the thrashing trees in stark, ghostly flashes, followed by peals of thunder that echoed off the mountains like the wrath of God. Alastair Finch bowed his head against the wind and rain, his horse skittish beneath him. The storm was a physical manifestation of the turmoil in his own soul. It was a cleansing fury, a righteous gale come to scour the valley of its rot. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the lightning. In those brief, electric moments, he saw the Croft farmstead ahead, a black silhouette against the raging sky. It looked like a skull half buried in the earth, its windows like vacant eye sockets. He tethered his horse in the relative shelter of a thicket of pines and approached the house on foot, his boots sinking into the sodden ground. The wind shrieked around the corners of the house, a high, mournful sound like a woman weeping. The place was dark. No lamps burned in the windows. Finch wondered if Silas Croft was asleep or if he was waiting in the dark, a patient spider in the center of his web. He tried the front door. Locked. He moved around the side of the house, the rain plastering his hair to his scalp, his duster heavy with water. He found a window into what looked like a pantry. Using the butt of his pistol, he smashed a single pane of glass, the sound swallowed by a clap of thunder. He reached inside, unlocked the latch, and slid the window open, hoisting himself into the blackness within. The air inside the house was cold, still, and unnaturally clean. It smelled of lye soap and lemon oil, the smell of a place obsessively scrubbed of any trace of life. He drew his pistol his senses on high alert. He moved through the downstairs rooms, a ghost in the machine. The parlor was neat and orderly, the furniture covered in white dust cloths. The kitchen was spotless, every pot and pan hanging in its proper place. It was a museum, not a home. A perfect, sterile facade for the abomination it concealed. He found the door to the root cellar at the back of the kitchen, just as Martha's journal had described it. It was thick, heavy oak, bound with iron straps, and secured with a massive iron bolt. It was less a door than a vault hatch, a seal on a tomb. As he stood before it, another flash of lightning illuminated the room, and he saw them, a series of scratches on the wood around the bolt. Deep, frantic gouges, as if someone had been trying to claw their way out. He put his ear to the cold, solid wood. At first, he heard nothing but the pounding of his own heart and the roar of the storm outside. Then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic noise from the other side. A dry, rasping sound. Asterisk scrape. 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 Asterisk it was the sound of a fingernail being dragged across wood, or perhaps a rock against the stone walls. It was a sound of mindless, desperate repetition, the sound of a life reduced to a single, meaningless act. It was the sound of the grave. Finch's resolve hardened into a diamond point of fury. The time for stealth was over. He took a step back, raised his foot, and kicked the door with all his strength. The wood shuddered, but the bolt held. He kicked again and again, the sound of the impacts like hammer blows against a coffin. The bolt was old, its housing in the frame weakened by years of damp. On the fourth kick, there was a splintering crack, and the door flew inward, opening into a black, gaping maw that smelled of damp earth, mildew, and human despair. He stood at the precipice of the abyss, the cold, stale air washing over him, and peered down into the waiting darkness. The darkness of the root cellar was a physical thing. It was a thick, cold blackness that seemed to suck the light and air from the kitchen. It carried a stench that turned Finch's stomach, the smell of unwashed bodies, of human waste, of rot, and a deeper, more profound scent of hopelessness. He fumbled in his coat for the small oil lantern he carried, his hands shaking as he struck a match. The flame flickered, then caught, casting a small, wavering pool of yellow light into the oppressive gloom. He held the lantern high and descended the stone steps. The scraping sound had stopped. The cellar was silent now, a waiting, watchful silence. The steps were slick with a damp, greenish slime. The walls were weeping stone, a latticework of pale, ghostly fungus clinging to the mortar. At the bottom of the stairs, he raised the lantern higher, and the scene that unfolded before him would be seared into his memory for the rest of his days. The cellar was small, no more than 12 feet square. In one corner stood a single, filthy mattress, stained and torn. In another, a pair of overturned buckets. But it was the figures huddled against the far wall that made his breath catch in his throat. There were 3 of them. They were women, but only just. Their skin was a pale, almost translucent white, the color of grubs found under a rock. Their hair was long, matted, and colorless. They were emaciated, their limbs like sticks, their joints swollen. They wore simple, shapeless shifts that were little more than rags, hanging from their skeletal frames. They did not look up at the light. They cowered, shielding their eyes, their faces pressed against the cold stone. They made small, animalistic sounds, whimpers of fear. These were not the bright, vibrant girls Martha Croft had described in her journal. These were creatures of the dark, feral things that had been stripped of their humanity piece by piece over a decade of unrelenting horror. These were the ghosts of Alara, Maeve, and Cora Croft. "It's all right," Finch said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I'm here to help you." At the sound of his voice, one of them, the tallest, looked up. Her eyes were huge in her starved face, the pupils dilated to black pools. There was no recognition in them, no understanding. Only a vast, bottomless terror. She bared her teeth in a silent snarl, her body tensing like a cornered animal. Finch took a slow step forward, his heart breaking. "Alara," he whispered, guessing at the eldest. "Maeve? Cora? My name is Alistair. I'm a friend." He took another step, and a floorboard creaked above him. He froze. A shadow fell across the opening at the top of the stairs. Silas Croft stood there, silhouetted against the stormy night, holding not a gun, but his black, unadorned Bible. He looked down into the cellar, his expression not of anger or surprise, but of sorrowful disappointment, like a teacher discovering his pupils have been misbehaving. "You have trespassed, Marshal," he said, his calm, resonant voice cutting through the tension. "You have broken into my sanctuary and disturbed my flock." He descended the stairs slowly, deliberately, his presence filling the small space with an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. The three women whimpered and pressed themselves flatter against the wall at his approach. "They are not your flock," Finch growled, raising his pistol. "They are your prisoners." Silas Croft smiled, a serene, pitying smile. "You see with the eyes of the world, Marshal. You see only flesh. I am concerned with the eternal soul. I brought them here, away from the filth and temptation of your world, to preserve their purity. In this darkness, they are safe. In this silence, they can hear the word of God. I have saved them from the damnation that awaits all who live in the light." He was utterly, completely mad, but his madness had a logic as sharp and cold as a surgeon's scalpel. He truly believed what he was saying. He believed this pit of horror was a holy place. The confrontation Finch had expected, the violent clash of good and evil, was not happening. This was a theological argument at the edge of hell. As Silas took another step, one of the girls, perhaps Maeve, the one with her father's will, let out a low, guttural cry. She scrambled away from him, crab-like, her eyes wide with a terror that was now mixed with a flicker of something else, a deep, primal rage. For a decade, this man had been their god, their warden, their tormentor. But now, a new element had been introduced. The outsider, the light. The spell was broken, and in that moment, the victim became the avenger. With a shriek that was barely human, she launched herself not at Finch, but at her father. She clawed at his face, her filthy nails seeking purchase. Silas stumbled back, surprised for the first time, his Bible falling to the stone floor. "Child, no!" he cried, his mask of piety cracking. The other two sisters, galvanized by the act of rebellion, joined the attack. They fell upon him like a pack of starving wolves, a flurry of pale limbs and matted hair. It was not a fight. It was a reckoning. It was a decade of silent suffering, of stolen light, of unspeakable degradation, erupting in a final, convulsive act of horrific violence. Finch could only watch, frozen in horror and a kind of terrible, grim understanding, as the farmer's horrible secret was finally and irrevocably brought to an end by the very hands he had sought to purify. The aftermath was a scene of profound and terrible stillness. Silas Croft lay on the damp stone floor of the cellar, his serene madness silenced forever. His Bible lay open beside him, its pages spattered with the blood of the shepherd, shed by the hands of his flock. The daughters, their terrible, frenzied rage spent, had retreated to the far corner, huddled together in a trembling, whimpering mass. The feral fire in their eyes was gone, replaced by a vacant, catatonic shock. They were not liberated. They were simply broken in a new and more final way. Alastair Finch stood amidst the carnage, the lantern light flickering on the unspeakable tableau. The clean, righteous fury that had driven him was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching sorrow. He had brought the truth to light, but the light had only revealed a deeper darkness. There was no victory here. There was no justice. There was only the ruin of human souls. He slowly ascended the stairs, leaving the three women in the dark silence that had been their world. He walked through the sterile, orderly house and out into the storm. The rain was slackening, the thunder now a distant grumble. A new, clean day was dawning, but it brought no comfort. The task before him was immense and impossible. He had to bring the Croft sisters out of the cellar and into a world they no longer knew, a world that would see them not as victims, but as monsters, as parasites. He had to explain a horror that defied explanation to a town that had willfully blinded itself for a decade. The news fell upon Blackwood Creek like a shroud. When Finch returned with a small, hastily assembled posse of frightened men from the next county, the town emerged from its homes, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The sight of the three Croft sisters, pale and blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight, wrapped in blankets, their eyes vacant and unseeing, shattered the valley's fragile peace forever. The lie they had all agreed to live was torn away, and they were forced to look at the raw, festering wound they had allowed to grow in their midst. Sheriff Jedediah Thorne, his face ashen, could only stare, the full weight of his cowardice finally crushing him. The whispered story of the Croft girls who died of consumption was replaced by the horrific, undeniable truth of the girls who had been buried alive, the girls who had murdered their father. The story became a new and more terrible legend. The legal proceedings were a formality. The three sisters were declared mentally incompetent, their minds having been shattered beyond repair by years of abuse and isolation. They were sent to a state asylum, a more sterile and spacious prison than the one their father had built, but a prison nonetheless. They never spoke a coherent word again, living out their days as ghosts, forever trapped in the twilight of their own minds. Alastair Finch filed his report. He detailed the discovery of Thomas Reed's body, buried in a shallow grave behind a barn. He detailed the contents of Martha Croft's journal and the confession of Sheriff Thorne. He described the conditions in the root cellar. But the dry, official language of the law could not capture the essence of the horror. It could not describe the smell of despair, the sound of fingernails scraping on wood, or the look in a young woman's eyes when a decade of darkness is finally broken. Finch left Blackwood Creek as quietly as he had arrived. The valley was no longer still. It was a place of recrimination and shame, the poison of the Croft secret now flowing openly through the community, turning neighbor against neighbor. The conspiracy of silence had been broken, but what replaced it was not healing, but a slow, corrosive decay. The Croft farmstead was abandoned, left to be reclaimed by the wilderness. The locals said it was haunted, that on stormy nights you could still hear the sound of weeping from beneath the earth. The story became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of the price of willful blindness. It spoke of the evil that can flourish in the dark, quiet places of the world, shielded by piety and fear. It was a testament to the fact that some secrets, once unearthed, do not bring closure, but only reveal the true depth of the wound, a wound so profound that it can never truly heal. The farmer's horrible secret had been exposed, but the ghosts of Alara, Maeve, and Cora Croft would haunt the hollows of Blackwood Creek forever, eternal symbols of the justice that came far, far too late.